Alrighty, so who are you and what is your story?
My name is Taylor Ann Drew. I grew up here in Tallahassee. I came here when I was 3 years old. My dad started a business with his brother. So we moved our family up here. He's originally from Quincy. And so I'm the third of four children. And we moved here in 87. And so I grew up in Tallahassee, went to Maclay for 1 year. And then I went to Gilchrist, Raw, Leon, and then moved off to Gainesville for college. Well, I'm sorry, that's not true. I moved to University of Central Florida. This is an important part of the story. So I went to UCF for 2 semesters, but I ended up failing out of college. My brother had passed away. He was hit by a car and died when I was graduating high school, actually. He was on the way home from my high school graduation and was chasing his dog on the road, got hit by a car. He was 25. And so I went to college anyway, thinking that it was a good idea because, well, any 18-year-old thought that would be a good idea, right? And so I ended up failing out. And backstory to this is that I've always been hyperactive. I've always been excitable. People say, how do you have so much energy? Well, back in the early 2000s, this is when ADHD was getting diagnosed. And I was finally diagnosed at the age of 16, but throughout my life I had a hard time focusing, and I was always the kid that got sat next to the teacher, and the next year's teachers were warned about Taylor distracting class, but I always got A's, I always passed. I was just the kid that was clowning around and talking to everybody, and was just very excitable, annoying, right? That's kind of how people with ADHD are. You're annoying, you talk too much, you interrupt people, and that's our brains work so fast, right? So in high school, at that point in time, I initially thought I had depression, which was true, and anxiety, which was also true because my ADHD was untreated. Well, once I finally got into the care of the right person, they said, this child is poster child for ADHD. You could look it up in the DSM-4 at the time, and you can see her picture there. So I was started to get medicated in high school, but was resistant to it because the stigma that's attached to getting care for psychiatric treatment, especially as a teenager. So I would lie, not take my medications. I was more wild then than I ever was because, well, I was 16, 17 years old. So I still made good enough grades to get into college, and I got into UCF. However, once my brother passed away, I decided to not take any meds, kind of went off the deep end and ended up moving to Colorado. I went snowboarding for a couple of years, started getting in trouble out there. I don't want to get too deep into that, but it was truly because my brother had passed away. I had anxiety, depression, and the anxiety and depression really were caused from the untreated ADHD. Because once you're untreated, your brain goes all over the place, you feel nervous, and then you're nervous for so long, you get depressed, right? And the reason I know this, I'm a nurse practitioner, and I really focus on mental health now because of the history I had with growing up with ADHD untreated, unmanaged depression, anxiety. I found, and my brother passing away, of course, the grief that came along with that. I again went off the deep end, but I left for a couple years to Colorado, went snowboarding. It was a great experience, but I wasn't doing well mentally. My family knew that, and they said, hey, you need to come back home. Of course, I wanted to resist it, but they were right. And I did come back home, and they said, okay, well, you can get your bright futures back, a scholarship back if you go through these steps, which I decided to do. So I had a decision at that point in time. Do I go stay in Colorado, continue up to no good? Where would I have been then? I don't know, thankfully, because I decided to come back, start school again. Since I had failed out of UCF, I had to start back at community college.
I'm a big supporter.
I went to Santa Fe. It was the best experience. Actually, it was amazing because we had classes of 20 people. And this is part of the story I'm grateful for, is that in UF, once I did transfer over to UF, there is a class of hundreds of people. Well, at Santa Fe, there was 24 people in my classes. And so with ADHD, which at that point I finally got on medication and I was doing much better, but there's 24 people in a class, and we actually had cadavers because I was starting to get into nursing, or I didn't know if I wanted to go to medical school or nursing school. My mom's a nurse, dad's an entrepreneur, like I said. So got into Santa Fe, did incredibly well, made all A's the whole time I was there. Got into University of Florida. At that point, I didn't know if I thought I was going to go to medical school. And so I got into the health science program there and did incredibly well, made a 4.0 throughout college. And, throughout this time, I've continued to go to therapy, and I still go every other week just to go and talk at someone.
Absolutely.
Right? You always have to have somebody to talk to. Side note, it shouldn't always be your friends or family because they might not have the capacity. You know what I mean? So identifying that and respecting people's boundaries. So go through college and doing really well. It was the best time of my life. I got the help I needed. My friends were supportive. My family was supported. And it's funny because once I started taking medications and started getting treatment, I was a different person. Depression was resolved, the anxiety was managed, the ADHD was managed, and I made all A's. Yeah. I crushed school, and so I applied to Columbia for nurse practitioner school, and I applied to Vanderbilt for nurse practitioner school, and and a few other programs I got into. And it was funny reporting back to my family and friends. Some of them didn't know what I'd gone through, and they're going, I didn't know you were smart enough to go to those schools.
That's very...
Oh, and it's funny because we have this thing with people that might be annoying or, goofing off in class. They might not be intelligent, and they might be. They might just be struggling with this disorder that they haven't been treated for. And right, so people, they see this one thing, but they don't really know what's going on inside. So I'm grateful for the people I've surrounded myself with, my family that's been supportive throughout it and really helped me excel. And so I went to Vanderbilt. It was a little more affordable than Columbia. I was sad to not live in New York City, but it was probably a better decision long term. Did great throughout that program. It took me a couple of years to get through nurse practitioner school, which is the norm, and graduated and moved to California.
Awesome.
Decided that I wanted to go to Lake Tahoe, go snowboarding again. It's a Florida girl, but love snowboarding, right? Love the beaches too.
Yeah, it's crazy what just knowing what you have can do for somebody. We had someone on for a story that they were, for lack of a better term, bullied by their grandmother growing up, and later on in her life, they found out that she had bipolar disorder and she had schizophrenia as well, and they didn't find out till she was 90 years old potentially. And it's crazy because you coin things off as a kid not being smart, or you coin things off as someone being moody or things like that, and it's way deeper than that. And I think that's something that's come to light only recently, like you said earlier on, that these symptoms were only being talked about, or these conditions were only being talked about in the early 2000s. They were starting to be talked about then, like seriously, like you might be dealing with this. And so it's crazy. It's awesome to see where we've come. I do still think there's a negative stigma to a lot of people behind it, but I mean, when my parents were growing up, for example, no one talked about it, right? So
who talked about it? And if you did,
yeah, amazing. Exactly. So it's cool to see where we have come, but I still do think there is room to go. I still think there is progress to be made. I'm just curious as to what you think as a society, what could be done better in order to further how the comfortability of having those conversations about mental health, furthering people's knowledge on it, and making people aware that it is a thing. How do you think we can do that better?
That's actually a great question, and that's one of the things that I'm tackling. I opened a clinic, Aquarian Clinic, which is a direct primary care office, and we mostly do primary care. However, my passion is really working with people of all kinds, but really talking to people about mental health, wellness, and a mental health hygiene. It's not about getting to a point where it's almost irreversible, right? Going one path or the other. You have to, and again, I brought this up, I see a therapist every couple of weeks just to talk about things. And so I think it's really important that there's more access to therapists, that it's okay to go to therapists. Insurance doesn't even pay for that for the most part. So on that side of things, allowing that to be covered by insurance companies, continuously having open conversations with your friends, your family, how you're feeling. And again, not necessarily burdening them with that, but them then having the ability to say, hey, maybe it's a good idea for you to talk to somebody. Instead of being stigmatized as if I suggest you go talk to somebody, people might be offended by that, right? Oh, what do you think, I'm crazy? Why is that our response? Well, I don't know, because that's just what it's been. And you're right. It's conditioned, absolutely. And so any perception can be a reality, right? And so if I perceive myself as what people thought of me as, annoying, hyperactive, impulsive, all these things, I could have never been where I am now. But what I realized, it's actually my strength. I can multitask like none other, right? I can get things done. I am energetic, when I am on during the day, I'm on. And instead of saying, Taylor, you're annoying, you're frustrating, you annoy people, which is a script in your head, right? I changed that. But I own a yoga studio, and part of what I do is teach people about, positive thinking, positive thoughts, positive affirmation. And so telling yourself, you're not annoying. That might be the script in your head. That's your perception, which is then your reality, right? It's not that. You're strong, you're motivated, you have the energy to do things that people might not be able to do. Way to go. You get out there and do that.
Right? Absolutely. And that's my next question was going to be a lesson or advice that you may have. And I think there was an incredible lesson in what you just said, in the fact that you found a way to make what you considered a weakness at one point a strength of yours, being able to multitask like none other, rather than you've been able to use that to your advantage. And I think that's such a powerful thing that is hard to harness when you're so dead set on this is a weakness of mine. But the second there's a crack in that shield, you're able to find those opportunities where you can make it an advantage. And I think it's a rabbit hole to go down, but I think school makes that hard at times to find those avenues of where you can use these weaknesses to be an advantage. But yeah, that's awesome. That was my next question. So convenient that you kind of followed it in. And I think a huge thing that I kind of want to add to the whole conversation, I think a big thing that's changed throughout time is people have learned that they're not alone in these situations. Our parents, for example, that never talked about it, probably did feel alone in that situation, because a lot of people, even though they never talked about those feelings, it's not to say they weren't there. So people were dealing with these behind closed doors and probably felt like they were alone in that situation. And someone, I've dealt with, I would not say I'm not diagnosed, but I have dealt with anxiety, especially from school, depression at times, but on a minor level. But even then, it opens my eyes holy cow, someone that is medically diagnosed with this, I couldn't imagine what it could be like.
Well, I think from that, it's really being vulnerable to, and saying, even you saying that then, when I'm in school and I felt anxious, that's a vulnerability that some people don't feel comfortable saying, I am anxious, and identifying that, and then saying it out loud to somebody else. Sometimes just saying it out loud to somebody, hey, I feel anxious. I don't feel happy right now. That's a vulnerability of bringing that out of yourself and saying it. Sometimes that's all it needs to have somebody, okay, I can identify this feeling, I'm feeling this feeling, and that's okay. And I tell people it's okay to not be okay. If we were okay all the time and life was always exciting, well, you have to have the lows and the highs. If you don't have the lows and the highs, life would be boring. It'd be really boring, right? So being vulnerable And also taking away the ego, owning things. Once you own the anxiety. I own it. I have ADHD. This isn't going to put me, it's going to help me. It's not going to hinder me. Right? I have anxiety. But that anxiety, sometimes I transform to excitement. Am I anxious right now? I'm really excited. Right? Am I anxious about being on camera, or am I excited about sharing my story? So it's about changing the perception, because again, your perception is your reality.